I'm Mark Lance. I'm 66. I live in Washington, D.C. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. My parents were both first generation college students from Southern Ohio. I didn't actually know my dad's family at all. My mom's family was from very rural Southern Ohio. So I spent my summers down in a tiny little town, uh, basically in tobacco farming country. Um, I started college in music school, actually. I was an orchestral trumpet player, but discovered philosophy along the way just from taking a gen ed course and absolutely fell in love with it. Um, Eventually changed to that. And also from hanging out with some philosophers is where I got really involved in radical politics and activism and organizing and things like that. Sort of basically, I was sitting around one day, and a couple of the students declared that I was pig ignorant about what my country's role in the world was, and I took them seriously enough to go research it and look into these things, and kind of never looked back. But anyway, I eventually changed into philosophy and math. Uh, did my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, sort of been in both, mostly philosophy, but quite a bit of math and logic and stuff as well. Um, was teaching at Georgetown for 35 years or so. I started there I did a postdoc for 3 years at Syracuse, taught at Georgetown from 1991 until last summer. Um, all through that period, especially starting in grad school, I was sort of had two lives for a while. I did activism and organizing because basically I was convinced that given the privileges that I had and the kind of institutions that those rested on, it was a responsibility. So, I mean, we can talk more about that, but I began doing both of those. And they were sort of parallel lives for a long time. But at some point in, I guess it was around 93, 94 at Georgetown, at the encouragement of some other folks, we started a program on justice and peace, which really kind of integrated a lot of the political side of my life and the academic side of my life. And I, for the next 30 years, taught courses around organizing and resistance and sometimes political philosophy, taught a few courses on anarchism. Um, Also done a lot of popular education things over the years. I worked with the Institute for Anarchist Studies for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And we organized a whole bunch of popular education things. I've taught at the Institute for Social Ecology, bunch of ad hoc, workshops and seminars. I mean, by a bunch, I mean like over 100, surely, workshops on various things from topical issues like Palestine. I do a bunch of work on that, to concrete organizing tactics and strategy and everything. And yeah, that's been my basic structure of my academic career. I am, my work ranges from super abstract philosophy of language and logic down to very concrete, um, applied politically relevant stuff. Um, I retired last summer, mostly thinking that I was going to kind of do a little writing and coach rowing, which is my other avocation. Um, but, then with fascists taking over the government, I decided I needed to devote a great deal of time to organizing. So I'm doing that now. I'm basically doing a lot of political work, and the writing's kind of on hold for right now. I feel like I've got the geek route because I really got into it by reading. So as I say, a couple already radical guys in undergrad challenged me this way, and I went off and read stuff. I read both. I read a bunch of Chomsky back then, Angela Davis, but various other people, and got convinced that basically about fundamental stuff like imperialism and sexism and racism and stuff like that. I spent easily 6 months. My reaction to Chomsky was always, I would read things, I'd be like, this guy's got to be quoting this shit out of context. This can't be accurate. And I'd go to the library and dig around and be like, shit, he's right. Um, so that led me to think that I just needed to make part of my life responding to all this stuff. When I went to grad school at Pittsburgh, um, I went looking for groups to work with. And actually, the group that I first found that seemed to me to be doing something useful was a group sort of led by radical Catholics and Quakers. It was a weapon around weapons manufacturing and nuclear war and stuff like that. So I started working with them on that campaign, met another bunch of people, including John, who may even be one of the people you're interviewing here. Um, uh, and we did both academic and political work together for a couple decades. Um, and I had some excellent mentors from that group who sort of taught me the nuts and bolts of practical organizing. Meanwhile, this was when the South African anti-apartheid divestment movement was kicking into gear really, really seriously. So I was part of the core organizing team at the University of Pittsburgh around that. We spent basically one academic year living in a shanty town on the quad at the University of Pittsburgh. In that, with that work, I met Dennis Brutus, who was a professor at Pitt, had actually been a cellmate of Mandela's for a while, and then had been exiled from South Africa. He was this sort of most famous as the author of the Olympic boycott of South Africa, but he was also a key mentor in those years. And we later did other kinds of work together after apartheid fell. And also at the same time, there was a huge amount going on in Latin America with the various Reagan wars and terrorist groups he was supporting and military governments and things. A lot of refugees that I did some work with. And I guess finally, in that sort of late 80s, early 90s period, I did some volunteering just because they needed some help with a group in Pittsburgh that would become an ACT UP chapter, so around the AIDS crisis. And that was kind of my main introduction to LGBT politics. Really amazing people and very formative for me. The world was very different in those days. Growing up in the 70s, most people didn't even know they had met a gay person in high school. That part changed when I went to music school, but my sort of involvement in that as a political activity started from these just sort of showing up to stuff envelopes or whatever with the ACT UP guys. Let's see. After grad school, or actually late in grad school, I got by pure chance involved in Palestine work. It wasn't one of the areas I was already working in, South Africa, Latin America, nuclear weapons, a little bit of LGBT stuff. But this friend of mine, Todd May, went on a delegation to the West Bank during the first Intifada and was just disappeared, basically. Was arrested, taken to what's called the Russian compound, place where they've systematically tortured people. Turned out they didn't, being an American citizen, but we had no idea where he was. And his wife asked me if I could do some press work to publicize the fact that he had been disappeared. And so I did. And then it kind of one thing led to another, and that became a big hunk of my work. And I did a lot of work during the first Intifada. When the second Intifada started in 2000, a friend of ours from the West Bank called and said, things are heating back up again. So a whole national organization called Sustain, Stop U.S. Tax Aid to Israel Now. I was later chair of the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights and, et cetera, et cetera. I did a lot of that stuff. The LGBT stuff I also kind of pursued because I found myself for what was it, for 5 years living in a Virginia town halfway between Richmond and DC, and um, sort of looking around for what was needed in that context. It wasn't a radical town by any stretch of the imagination. And actually talking to the Unitarian minister there, he said, well, there's not a single out gay space in this town of any sort, whether bar, club, or political organization. So PFLAG chapter, Parents, Family, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which became kind of everything for everyone, grew like enormously. And I just sort of saw my role there to train local people to be public speakers and to go into communities and work on that stuff. So that became a little part of my work, and that's kind of persisted to now. There's, I've mostly my work has, as I said, I worked with the Institute for Anarchist Studies for a while, which publishes a journal, gives grants to writers, and then often sets up sessions at conferences and various things. Most of my work has not been in organizations or formations that use the word anarchism. It's mostly been pragmatically chosen things like looking at who was doing something that looked useful at a given point, and had some functional folks in it, but have always tried to sort of encourage anti-hierarchical structures within the organizations I've worked in. And I think that's been quite successful. Frankly, I think a number of the, say, solidarity organizations I've worked with have actually lived up to anarchist principles better than organizations that circle the A's. But yeah, I've just been doing this stuff as part of my life all the way through. As I say, in this academic side with the Justice and Peace program, I have been part of the training of several generations of activists. Still doing some like online courses around political issues. Right now, my work is mainly coordinating one of the local wards of DC around this DC for Palestine program. Still work with the Georgetown University student, faculty, and staff for Justice in Palestine. And then I'm working with a local DC formation called Free DC that's kind of confronting the various attacks on the city that the current regime is carrying out, and then doing political education as needed or requested around the world. So that's kind of been my trajectory. I've played different roles at different times. I've been arrested like 15 times in civil disobedience actions. I don't do as much of the actual street confrontation. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention I've done some anti-fascist organizing as well, and some kind of more direct confrontational stuff. Never been, never been in prison for long for my work, but I did once have a cop tear my rotator cuff because he was mad at me for making him do extra paperwork, as far as I could tell. I'm on a lot of blacklists and various death threats from white nationalists and stuff, but that goes with the territory. Nowadays, my health isn't nearly what it used to be. I have various, actually, turns out to be genetic lung issues. So I'm not going out to find places where there will be tear gas. I'm doing more stuff somewhat behind the scenes, but that's part of the way these things go. You contribute in different ways at different stages of your life with what you have, what resources you have to offer. So that's a quick rundown of my trajectory. Basically, I take anarchism to largely be a theory of social organization, or a kind of ongoing and developing tradition of theories of social organization. And the core idea is that we ought to organize ourselves non-hierarchically, right? Come to agreement through rational persuasion, through moral concern, through democratic, direct democratic dialogue, um, not through threat of violence or institutionalized privilege or anything like that. So, if you see that as the core of anarchism, I guess a couple of things. One is it can be built anywhere locally, right? I mean, as Colin Ward said a long time ago, we all live in anarchist worlds all the time when our friends decide to go out to dinner. Nobody is the boss and gets to dictate where we're going to dinner on pain of throwing you in a cage. We talk about it and make a decision that's reasonable. Most informal groups are structured that way, or roughly that way. And so one way to think of it, of the process of anarchism, is to expand the range of things that are like that, while combating the things that aren't, like governments and militaries and cops and economy. So, my feeling has always been that if I'm going to be seriously invested in any political organization, I expect it to be run that way, to not have an institutionalized hierarchy set of, leadership can mean many, many things. Of course, there's perfectly good senses of leadership, but not a leadership that gets to just simply dictate to people what they do. Makes decisions through respectful dialogue and consensus as much as possible and things of that sort. Um, on the broader issues, I certainly gravitate toward working with people who are anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, and things like that. But I also am perfectly okay with, as it were, temporary alliances, right? If some uh, liberals want to work to end the genocide in Gaza, I'm not going to put up a barrier that says, well, you got to sign on to being anti-capitalist to do this work. We'll work with anyone who is supposed to genocide, and but then if people are open to talking about broader issues, I always am keen on doing that as well. So yeah, so that's I mean, I can send you stuff. I have longer things on how I think about anarchism, but I'll say, and I think this kind of fits with this strategy of trying to work it out in local contexts first, and then to connect those local contexts up with each other in a democratic, non-hierarchical manner. Um, I think that anarchist tradition is very much an experimental one. Um, One of the things that sort of classical conservatism, in my view, was absolutely right about is that whatever nice theories we might come up with, we don't know how those are going to work in practice until they've been implemented for a long time. Social reality is an incredibly complex place. And, this is part of my objection to the practice of Marxism in most places, is that, you can write up your 10-year revolutionary plan and it all looks nice on paper. And then when you start confronting all the details of things, it can all go to shit and be just as authoritarian as what you're attacking. And I think the anarchist tradition pretty consistently has opposed that idea. Has sort of they wouldn't put it this way, but have taken on that conservative idea that, look, we need to structure ourselves in as non-hierarchical manner as we can, but the details of that's going to work is something we're going to have to knock out in practice, figure out through trial and error and experiment. If you look, for example, at the history of Catalonia from 1900 to the war that destroyed it, there was enormous, kind of experimentation going on in all elements of society, from the economic to the family to how to deal with alcoholism. I mean, there's an extraordinary, yeah, social experiments happening. So I think that what I guess I'd call a kind of political epistemic humility, to my mind, has been a key part of the anarchist tradition that I very much respect. And so I see all of these attempts by different kinds of small groups to live out something like an anti-authoritarian praxis to be, well, in anarchist terms, prefigurative experiments, building little models of a new world so that we can teach ourselves how we might actually build one. Structuring ourselves around anti-authoritarian ideas is, to my mind, an extremely central part of uh, being a human, being an autonomous human. I think it's key to human freedom. To be free is to have an appropriate role in the decisions of the conditions under which you live. Um, I don't think that anyone is free under a system in which there's an institution that can set the conditions of your existence and throw you in a cage at gunpoint if you don't live up to those. Um, so to me, it's. I mean, this actually, I think, connects to some very Kantian ideas, though Kant himself certainly wouldn't have thought they went this direction. But I think the ability to govern your autonomy rationally, which is also a social process, is a key to taking yourself seriously as a human being. Um, and so, to answer your question directly, yeah, I identify as an anarchist. As I say, I don't always identify with all the groups themselves anarchist. I think I actually have a paper on this, but I think you can sign on to what I just said theoretically, and then in practice make all of that look like bullshit, either because people are arrogant or haven't examined the ways in which they're privileged or are just, assholes. And so in the early 2000s, when I was working with this group Sustain, which by if any anthropologist had looked at it, they'd have said, "Oh, this is an organization structured around anarchist principles." There was also a very large anarchist group in DC, and I once was talking with a guy, and he said, "Oh, do you know that group?" I said, "Yeah, I've been to a couple of their meetings." And he laughed and laughed, and he said, "Yeah, they're known for being the group where everyone will scream at each other and possibly get into physical fights for 2 hours over ordering a vegan pizza." And I said, "Yeah, that's not entirely inaccurate as a description of the group." So, that was a group that signed on to anarchism in theory, but were completely, in my view, dysfunctional as a social space, didn't care for one another, didn't embody mutual aid. Um, no one was officially the boss of anything, but decisions were made by more or less who shouted loudest or who made people feel the most guilty. And that's no closer to democratic rationality than having, a president is, in my view. So I think yeah, I absolutely consider myself an anarchist, but I also very much think that the reality of anarchism lies in the nitty gritty, down in the dirt details of how we treat one another um, in our practice, in our social practice. I don't think it would be a good strategy right now to organize our work against the fascist government in the US by declaring that we're the anarchist party or something. Um, but I feel like, kind of anarchism is the opposite to fascism. It is the guiding principle that all people deserve a role in deciding upon the structures of their own life, And those include, of course, the economic structures and the ways we distribute goods, which and the political decisions and the social decisions, everything. So it's, to my mind, the same principle that guides me to thinking that what gender someone wants to express is their business and doesn't affect anyone else. So shut the fuck up about it. To critiquing the idea that some guy has rights over $1 billion worth of public goods. All of these have to be challenged right now, frankly, in order for humanity to survive, given the environmental crisis. And if you attack them consistently, in my view, you'll be embodying anarchist, or at least, strongly anti-hierarchical principles. There's a whole lot of other detailed things from the anarchist tradition that I think are extremely valuable tactically and strategically. But yeah, I see a commitment to those core anarchist ideas as the absolute centerpiece of confronting fascism right now. And I think if you're not confronting fascism in a way that's systematically anti-hierarchical, well, you're just objecting to sort of that thing that affects you and throwing other people under the bus. I'll reframe the question slightly and say, are we going to move in a far more democratic direction, a more inclusive direction, a direction that starts removing economic barriers to freedom and political barriers to freedom and other kinds of violent barriers, or not? And I think the only honest answer to that question is that I don't know, and neither does anyone else, right? There's obviously a systematic attempt by the current political regime in Washington to roll away even modest liberal steps in the direction of democracy. Perfectly clear that they're systematically trying to undo power of courts, the power of civil society, the possibility of free educational institutions. And that's not just the US, it's a worldwide phenomenon. You see it very obviously in places like Israel and India and Turkey, Poland improved a bit recently, Hungary. It's a worldwide fascist phenomenon that there's been a growing right-wing authoritarianism. That could win. It could. These are incredible. These are complex systems in the technical decision theoretic sense, right? And nobody knows which way this is going to go, whether we will really turn that back and move toward what I would consider to be true democratic organization of society, whether we'll roll it back partially and bring back the kind of representative liberal systems that were dominant in the West for a while, whether we'll expand things to roll back the exploitation and outright murder of people in less developed parts of the world. That's a possibility too. And it's possible that the fascists will win. I don't personally think that predicting these things, I first think that anyone who thinks they have a clear prediction of which way this is going to go is just fooling themselves. I don't think I've watched experts announce so many things over the years and look like fools. I don't think you can predict these things accurately. But it also doesn't matter to me, right? If if some God being came down tomorrow and told me, well, the fascists are going to win in 20 years, I'd still fight them because I want to be known as one of those people who fought the fascists. I want to be able to look at my kid and my grandkids and say, I was on the right side of this, even if we lost. Um, and then, of course, that keeps a hope alive for some new movement in the future. But it's also just simply almost a kind of, I guess I'd say, existential commitment. That's who I am. This is the side I'm on. I'm on the side of the people getting it in the neck from the power structures. And I don't need to know that I'm going to win to make that choice, um, because it's the only way I want to live. It's the only people I want to live with are the other people in that movement and in those commitments. So yeah, I don't know whether we're going to win or partially win or totally lose. But I'm not going to stop fighting until I'm gone. I will go this far partly because this is more of a tactical question. So, I mean, the Democratic Party has, of course, moved to the right pretty consistently since FDR, um, and certainly starting with Clinton has been embracing things that would have been seen as right-wing principles. Now, the vast majority of the Democratic Party is further right than, say, Nixon was. Um, so it's been the opposite of any kind of a balanced discussion. On the other hand, there are, even in electoral politics, there are exceptions. There's Rashida Tlaib. There was Cori Bush until she was crushed by AIPAC, but she'll probably be back. There's this whole Sanders phenomenon. And if you uh, look at attitudes generationally, the youth in this country are by and large far more likely to embrace something genuinely left, even from democratic socialism to communism or anarchism, than they are to embrace the Democratic Party. Democratic Party is less popular than it's been in 50, 60 years. Um, I think we're definitely at a kind of tipping point in which a huge number of people feel that on the electoral front, if there's going to be any future to electoral politics, there has to be um, some much more genuine alternative to the Republicans than there currently is. And a lot of this, of course, came out because of Gaza. I mean, right? I mean, Israel's an apartheid, a colonial state for 70 years, an apartheid state for at least 50. But the current outright genocide and ethnic cleansing has just thrown this into public consciousness. And then to have the Democrats actively, militarily, financially, politically support it, cheering for it, was such a vulgar display. And Democrats have protected Israel through its whole existence, but they've always done it in a kind of cautious manner, encouraging them not to go too far, bunch of covering rhetoric about two states, things of that sort. Basically, the masks came off recently, both in Israel, where most of the politicians are explicitly calling for total ethnic cleansing, and in the US, where Biden just didn't even pretend. And that's made, I think, has created a huge rupture between especially the youth, but not only the youth, and the Democratic Party. So I think we're at probably, I mean, there's obviously, structural impediments to doing any kind of third party thing. And my personal political work isn't through through party politics. But I think there's more of a chance now of building something genuinely different than there has been since the early 20th century, probably. So I do think that the Democratic Party's at a crisis point, and it's going to cease to be relevant if it keeps trying to prove that it's practically the Republicans, but just a little bit nicer. Um, so there's a lot of openings there. As always, I think the key is how much grassroots pressure is put on whoever's elected. Um, these, people whose goal is to get elected have to respond to where the attitudes of the populace are. And, so I think the hope, the core hope for a counterweight is movement for Black lives and the movement of Palestinian solidarity and the movement for gender and sexuality equality and all of these movements that are growing and powerful, even if radically attacked right now. And then that will have a ripple effect on changing who gets elected into offices. So yeah, I think it's a crisis point for the Democratic Party, and I think it's one that I hoping that we in some collective sense, if we can take advantage of and do something useful with. There's kind of different ways to approach electoral politics. If your goal is systematic change, then you're probably going to think that it's not going to all come about that way. Certainly, some anarchists are doctrinaire about this and won't participate in a system that they consider to be corrupt and counter to their ideas. I think you need to make a distinction between strategy and tactics. No anarchist strategy is ever going to be to bring about the new world through electing the right people. There are some Marxists who think that if we could create a Marxist party and seize the power of the state, then we can bring about socialism that way. That's always historically been a big divide between the Marxists and the anarchists. But it doesn't follow that you have to be doctrinaire anti-electoral. I see electoral politics as a tactic. I look to see who it will be easier to organize, with whom with which candidate in power will it be easier to organize, right? I actually thought it was very clear that as much as Harris appalled me in various ways, militarism, capitalism, prison system, Gaza, I thought it was very clear that with Trump as president, we would be reacting to crises for the next 4 years rather than pushing our own agenda. So I thought it would be easier to organize for fundamental change under a Harris regime. I think a lot of local politics are absolutely crucial that way. I mean, look at what happened to your teacher in Texas, and this tells you the difference that local politics makes to the possibility of existing as a radical voice. So a lot of times I'm perfectly fine with saying I'm going to support this or that candidate but it's always because I believe that grassroots organizing with them in power will be easier than grassroots organizing with someone else in power. And it doesn't always have to be the politician who's closest to me, right? I mean, there may be cases in which it seems like we'll do better organizing with a clear enemy. Again, that's a risky strategy because when you elect clear enemies, it's because they're going to harm people. But yeah, I just see all of these questions about elections as tactical questions that have to answer to the overall strategy of organizing a mass movement that can change structures fundamentally, because no one is ever going to, or for a long time, no one's going to be running for a national office in the United States on a campaign of abolishing the military and the police and dismantling capitalism and the things that I think are crucial to a just world. So that stuff has to come from below. And the question is just, is it easy to get it from below? Are these guys in power or are these other guys?